Hey guys, all right, now we're going to kind of start getting into the meat and potatoes of economics. So, principles of economics, chapters 4 and 6. And this is going to talk about supply and demand, equilibrium, and policy. And honestly, folks, this is where things get really fun, as far as I'm concerned. Like, this is a exciting chapter. This is where things get really interesting. So, in vein of this, we're going to start getting into the meat and potatoes of economics, and that is markets. The core of economics is the study of markets. And the reason why is because in a lot of ways, markets is just this interaction of consumers and buyers. And we'll talk about this in a second, but overview, you're going to be looking at demand, supply, equilibrium, and elasticity. You're going to want to know the definitions of these items. You're going to want to know these different types of elasticities. You're going to want to know difference between demand and quantity demanded, supply versus quantity supplied, the consequences of shifts, demand shifters, supply shifters, shortages, and surpluses. So these are all the topics we're going to be talking about in this section. So let's get into it. What is a market? Really, fundamentally, it's just a group of buyers and sellers of a particular good or service. So there's a market for cell phones, right? You have sellers, Apple, Samsung, LG, Google, etc. Buyers, individuals buy phones, families buy phones, businesses buy phones, governments buy phones. But the reality is that these don't necessarily overlap, right? So for example, I don't know about you, but I am not in the market for a stealth fighter. However, the government is, and I don't know what Jeff Bezos does on the weekends, but I feel pretty comfortable in assuming that it's just the government interested in stealth jets. So the takeaway here is that not everyone participates in all markets, but there are markets for nearly everything. So in another example, eBay is kind of a market for a lot of things, right? It's an electronic market. So buyers and sellers come and produce and offer their goods. Fundamentally, markets are defined by their competitiveness. And what we mean by this is competitiveness is really largely defined as the power between producers and sellers, and the power of producers versus each other, and the power of buyers versus each other. So a competitive market, we say, is a market in which there are many buyers and many sellers. Each has a negligible impact on the market price. The closest example, the farmer's market. Perfect example here because, well, one, we're in Georgia. I don't know about you, but like a peanut's a peanut. If I went to a farmer's market, right, and there's 20 farmers selling peanuts, and one farmer comes up and goes, "Hey, man, let's get into the meat and potatoes of economics, supply and demand." So the demand curve, i.e. demand, is the relationship between price and quantity demanded. I want to be clear about this. Demand is the relationship between price and quantity demanded. So the law of demand claims that, other things equal, which there's this fancy Latin term, ceteris paribus, the quantity demanded of a good falls when the price of a good rises. Now this kind of makes intuitive sense, right? So let's just give a simple example of coffee. I really like coffee. If I go to McDonald's and McDonald's is like, "Hey, would you like coffee?" And they're like, "Our coffee is $1 for a large coffee," I'd be like, "Yeah, no, I'll definitely take that. I'll take that all day long. Heck, I might take two." But if I showed up and McDonald's was like, "Hey, here's a large coffee. It's $5. Just a black cup of coffee, but it's $5." Then it makes sense, right? Why I'd want that less and I'd purchase less of it. If only because, one, I'd buy 5 McDonald's coffees for the price of one versus $1 McDonald's coffees versus 5 McDonald's coffees. So the quantity demanded is the amount of a good that buyers are willing and able to purchase at a given price. So that makes sense, right? So for example, I said that like if McDonald's coffee is $1, I might be willing to buy 2, 3 McDonald's coffees a week. If McDonald's coffee was $5, I might not buy any in a week. The point here, though, is that demand does not equal quantity demanded. Demand is the sum of the quantity demanded for given prices. And the next slide is going to visualize this. So what does that mean is demand is how much coffee I am willing to consume at $5 plus how much coffee I'm willing to consume at $4 plus how much coffee I'm willing to consume at $3. And it is a curve that shows all those points that I'm willing to buy. That's my individual demand. We'll talk about this in a second. So demand schedule is a table that shows the relationship between the price of the good and the quantity demanded. So just imagine if I said, like I said, I gave you these different numbers. Let's just imagine you like drew it out on a table and you're like, this is the price. How much is Professor Mickelson willing to buy at this price? That much. And you went down, you listed all the prices and how much I'm willing to buy at each price. The demand curve is just a graph of that relationship. It's basically just a visual of the information on the demand schedule. And the demand curve is in effect the representative of demand and is a composite of all the quantity demanded at each given price. So to finish this up, you also have individual versus market demand. So we were talking about me at coffee and how I'm willing to buy a coffee at all these different prices. But the market isn't just me. The market is me plus everyone else. So consider you in the class. So let's, for example, say that we all were at McDonald's and McDonald's coffee was $1. The market demand for McDonald's coffee would then be all our demands for McDonald's coffee at $1, at $2, at $3, at $4. So here's just an example of demand schedule and curve, just so you can see, right? Like here's the demand schedule. You can see the price listed, $1.90, 80 cents. So this is in 10 cents increment going downwards. And notice that as it goes downwards, the quantity demanded goes up, right? This is basically people willing to buy fish sandwiches and how many fish sandwiches they're willing to buy. And it just shows that the cheaper it gets, the more is bought. So just to come with a McDonald's example, right? McDonald's probably sells way more of the food on the dollar menu than it would if they were $2 or $3. Pretty easy and straightforward, right? Not too tricky. So the thing to know here, though, is that, as we said, quantity demanded and price are related. And demand is the composite of all those points. However, price doesn't change demand. Price only changes the quantity demanded. And the demand, that entire curve, can shift. And so demand shifters are things that shift all the demand for a market left or right. So we only say left or right, never up or down. And the reason will become very clear. Just kidding. But scary music for this, but just kidding. Over here, you can see an illustration of a shift in demand curve. So here's the price of coffee on our y-axis, and here's the quantity demanded on our x-axis of our graph. Now, we start off at D1 and Q1. So that 1 means this is our initial starting point. So this is our point right here at this price, okay? If you notice, if we have a rightward shift in demand, we go over to D2. This is a rightward shift. Notice, why? Because this demand curve is right of the original demand curve. Notice that at the same price, this Q2 is greater than Q1. How can we tell? Because it's further away from here. So this point here is 0. The further away you get from 0, the higher the number is. So, okay, that makes pretty intuitive sense. The further right we go, then that makes sense that a rightward increase means, yeah, we have a higher quantity demand at the same price. Similarly, this Q3 in this left demand curve, it shows that at price 1, if you're on that demand curve, you're consuming less quantity demanded at the same price. And that's what's key, is at the same prices, these are a shift rightward means more consumed, shift leftward means less consumed. So what can shift demand? Well, there's a couple of things. First, easiest one's income. This pretty much makes sense, right? Like if I gave each of you $1,000 and then said, hey, let's go to McDonald's and let's have a drink of coffee, almost all of you would probably be like, oh yeah, no, I'm willing to pay $5 for a cup of coffee that you otherwise wouldn't have. Why? Because I gave you $1,000, right? So like compared to that. What's interesting here is that you actually have two kinds of good that are affected by income shifters. You have normal goods and inferior goods. And a normal good is a good that you are going to buy more of the higher your income gets. Steak is a classic normal good. Coffee is a normal good. Really good coffee is a normal good. But you also have inferior goods. And inferior goods are goods which, as your income goes up, you're going to buy less of. The classic example here is ramen noodles. Not like good ramen, like actual real ramen's good, but like that, like salt lick ramen that's like insta ramen, that is considered inferior good. As people's income go up, they normally consume much less ramen than they otherwise would. Chef Boyardee may be an example. Price of related goods, complement substitutes. So here's an interesting example for you. I don't know about you, but if the price of paper like skyrocketed and just like sheets of notebook paper became $10, my demand for pens would probably go down. That's an idea of a price of a complement. Complements are two goods that go together to work to like make a more cohesive product and like complement one another. Pretty easy, straightforward, makes sense. Substitutes, meanwhile, are alternatives to your good. So if the price of a substitute goes up, then that means the demand for your good actually goes up. Why? Because now it's relatively cheaper. Just a good example for you. I don't know about you. Subway doesn't really do it anymore, but when they had $5 footlongs, Black Forest ham was on the $5 footlong, while the footlong turkey sandwich was never on it. I prefer turkey to ham, but I don't prefer turkey so much more that I'm willing to pay $2 more than I would pay for ham. And so that's an example of a substitute to product same menu. The cheaper product was the one I went with because the price of the substitute was much higher. So that's just kind of a simple example, right? Like I jokingly want to say Coke and Pepsi, but I don't know about you. There's not a price that Pepsi could be cheap enough that I would prefer it to Coca-Cola. Taste and preferences. This is another thing, right? So markets are constantly shifting, and what people want in those markets also move. I don't know about you, but you might be seeing AHA and Bubbly way more often in stores. Part of that, right, is that Americans have had a shift in taste preferences away from like sugary drinks and sodas to like healthier, low-calorie options that don't have all the additives. Sparkling water is kind of trying to fill that gap, and so there's been a huge shift to purchasing things like sparkling water. Similarly, Apple versus Microsoft. These are big technological shifts and like competition between who gets what and taste and preferences and who shifts how we do this. Expectations, this is really easy. So if I told you that gas is going to be $5 tomorrow, what would you do today? Yeah, you'd go buy gas today, right? You'd fill up your tank. Similarly, if I told you that gas is going to be $1 tomorrow, you'd probably be like, I'm going to wait until tomorrow. So expectations, the interesting thing here is if you expect prices to go up in the future, then you buy more today. All right? If you expect prices to be up in the future, you demand more today. Similarly, if you expect prices to go down in the future, you demand less today. So the interesting thing here, and what's really important for all of this, is that we know what we mean by how these variables affect shifts. So just a reminder, when you go back to go do your notes, make sure you are comfortable with understanding how the income, the price of related goods, taste and preferences, expectations, and also this final one, number of buyers, influence demand, which number of buyers is pretty straightforward too. If number of buyers goes up, well, it makes sense Coca-Cola will sell more, right? There's just more people in the world. Now, supply, very, very tricky. Not at all, really, honestly. What you'll notice immediately if you're looking at the slide is that in a lot of ways, supply is exactly like demand, except for one key component. The supply curve is the relationship between price and quantity supplied. The law of supply, though, is the claim that this relationship, other things equal, ceteris paribus, the quantity supplied of a good increases when the price of a good rises. Now, quantity supplied is the amount of good that suppliers are willing and able to sell at a given price. Oh, that sounds kind of familiar, right? That's the exact same definition for demand, but for supply, right? So, nope, supply does not equal quantity supplied. Supply is the composite, the sum of the quantity supplied for given prices. And the key difference is the quantity supplied only changes based upon changes in price. Supply only changes with shifters. Now, why am I emphasizing all of this again? Here's why. Because inevitably, you will probably see a question that goes, hi guys, like, if the price of an item changes, what happens to supply? The answer, nothing. Price only affects quantity supplied. If it increases, quantity supplied goes up. If the price decreases, quantity supplied goes down. But supply does not change. Supply schedule. Table that shows the relationship between the price of good and the quantity supplied. Tell me if you've heard this before. The supply curve is a graph of the relationship between the price of good and quantity supplied, i.e. the supply curve is the visualization of the information in the supply schedule. And do you want to take a guess what the difference between individual versus market supply is? Right. An individual is a single producer supply for a good at given prices, and the market is just the sum of all the individual supply curves for producers. So just again, you can kind of visualize this and see a visualization. Starbucks supply schedule and curve. We see that as the price of the item goes up, Starbucks is willing to sell more and more lattes. Um, this doesn't quite make sense at the larger numbers. Here's the easier way I think to think of it. It makes sense, right? That I don't know about you, but I'm very unlikely to start going and making things that I expect to receive no money for as a business model, right? So that makes sense why Starbucks would only sell zero lattes. It also makes sense, right, that like if maybe you'd make some coffee for your friends and lattes for your friends, and like you're just like, hey guys, cover my costs. Like, yeah, okay, that's reasonable. The larger numbers, it doesn't make as much sense though. But here is the interesting thing. If you think about this as market supply, we actually have a really good example. If you remember right, the masks were sold out in March and April, and there were not many, and the price of masks rose dramatically. How many of you know someone that went out of their way to go make masks? A lot of people went and made masks. Some of them gave them away. A lot of people unfairly decided to fill the gap and make a little extra cash making masks. So in a lot of ways, the higher price and the increase of the quantity supplied really corresponds well to just the fact that at higher prices, a lot more people enter markets, especially when the costs are lower. So what are supply shifters? Again, supply will shift left when it goes down and right when it goes up. And now you're going to see why we said left and right and not up or down. So notice here, let's go to the supply curve. This is a leftward shift. What we're interested in always is this. Well, real simply, why left or right? The answer is because we're always interested in what is the quantity supplied at any given price. This is a clear leftward shift, right? So here was this original supply curve, and when we move to the supply prime, well, you can see at this point here, right? This is how much quantity was supplied at this given price, right? So you would trace it over here, and then you would come down, and you see that, yeah, no, that is the point that it intersected. However, what we see is that supply prime, the quantity supplied at any given price, is lower than the original line. Similarly, if we come over to here, you can see that for this rightward shift supply curve, the quantity supplied is higher at any given price than the original curve. So what changes this? A few things. We have input prices, which are the factors of production, the cost to produce a phone. Basically, if the input prices go up, and you can see this up here on the left-hand graph, input prices go up. If input prices go up, the supply shifts leftward. Basically, it becomes more expensive to produce an item, and therefore less people are in that market to produce. Similarly, if technology goes down, so imagine, for example, if we didn't have sewing machines to make masks. What if we just had to sew a mask by hand? Makes sense, right? The supply would go down because people wouldn't be able to make masks as quickly as possible. As quickly as they would otherwise. Similarly, if technology increases, right, like we introduce machines that make masks way more quickly, then it makes sense that the supply would increase. Why? Because increase in technology booms can increase the amount supplied by requiring either less inputs or speeding up production. Expectations, much like demand, but opposite direction. So, for example, if you're a gas station and you expect the price of gas is going to crash tomorrow, what are you going to do? You're going to try to sell as much gas as possible today. Similarly, if you expect prices are going to go up in the future, you'd probably like to try to not sell as much gas today. Real example, if you're wondering why we have such cheap gas prices, part of the reason why is the US was on course to be the world's largest oil producer. What happened? Actually pretty simple. The current world's largest oil producer, Saudi Arabia, realized that two things are going on. One, the world's largest importer, the United States, might be able to start relying more on its own oil and would therefore not need as much foreign oil. And two, a lot of the Western world, i.e. countries that import a lot of oil, are shifting dramatically to renewable energy and are making huge pushes for renewable energy. So what did Saudi Arabia do? Dumped the market. So Saudi Arabia has flooded the market with a ton of oil, and it's flooded prices. Why? Because they can make a lot of money at cheap prices. However, the rest of the world couldn't. And so if you look at some of the issues going on in Venezuela today, a lot of the issues going on in Venezuela today, directly tied to Saudi Arabia's move to drop oil. Similarly, Russia's had struggles, which kind of comes to a next point. Number of sellers. Straightforward, more sellers equals more supply. Now, what does this mean? Ultimately, it means that we can put together equilibrium, supply and demand, and consider them together. And equilibrium is a situation in which the market price level at which the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, i.e. the equilibrium price, the price that balances quantity supplied and quantity demanded, is where we get the equilibrium quantity, the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded at the equilibrium price. And note here that the quantity supplied equals the quantity supplied in equilibrium equals quantity demand equilibrium. This gets really, really redundant, but equilibrium, everything equals the same. Surplus, though, is a situation in which quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. This has a particular inefficiency over allocation of resources to a market, and you have way too much quality in items. Again, perfect example here. We're inventing unnecessary features to phones and adding them to phones just to incentivize people to buy these phones that they otherwise would not need. Similarly, a shortage is a situation in which quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. And here the inefficiency is that we've underallocated resources to a market, and quality deteriorates in these situations. Now, we have two simple examples. One of them is simple, straightforward, and readily available. The other one is a bit more dramatic, and that's because your professor's a history nerd. The straightforward example is, let's just think about housing in Athens, right? There's a housing shortage in Athens, which means that the quality of housing can deteriorate as prices rise. Why? Because what's the incentive for landowners to really renovate and keep care of their property outside of kind of personal integrity? Not a lot, right? Like, you could go up and be like, I have an issue with my apartment and my housing, and they could be like, so? Like, I mean, if you want to move out, someone else will readily step in and take your place, right? That's a challenge that comes with shortages. Now, the much more dramatic example, during World War I, there was just huge artillery battles. And so one particular one is the Battle of Somme, and the British came up with this great idea of, we will bombard the Germans for 72 hours. So for 72 hours, the British shot 1.5 million artillery shells at the German lines. And then they launched this massive charge, hundreds of thousands of people, British men charged the German lines to absolute disaster. Why? Most of those artillery shells were duds. Instead of the German line being battered after this huge barrage, they were instead completely fine, and it was considered one of the greatest disasters in British military history. So why were the shells left under? Well, in a war, the need to manufacture items is increasingly high, increasingly fast. And in order to meet the demand for munitions, what's the first thing you think munitions makers did? You start cutting back on the powder, right? You start cutting back and try to get the powder to as fine as necessary to ensure that the shells go off. In reality, though, the more and more you reduce the powder, that means the more likely it is for them to be duds, which means significant consequences. So again, this is just an example of where a shortage in the market led to kind of horrific consequences. But this kind of is our conclusion for today. We're going to finally just like look at equilibrium and disequilibrium. You can kind of see the visualization, right? So the supply curve intersects with the demand curve at our equilibrium, and that price that gets us that is the equilibrium price, and the quantity at it is the equilibrium quantity. Now, disequilibrium, just to show you two examples, when the price is above equilibrium price, that's when you get a surplus. And that is, you can see the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded, and that makes sense, right? Because the laws of both are in opposite directions. Similarly, when the price is below the equilibrium price, that's when you get a shortage of those goods. We'll talk about this a little bit in another chapter. This is where you get discussions of whether or not minimum wages create unemployment. Now, as a final point, we're going to consider some and demand shifts or supply shifts, or they shift together, or they shift in opposite directions. I highly recommend you sit down and look through this and practice. Just note that 1 is your starting point, right? So P1, Q1 at the intersection of S1 and D1. Sit down with this and draw some lines, because here's what I want you to see. Well, I would give you 2 simple examples. Look at first what happens when demand shifts from D1 to D2. So demand increases from D1 to D2. What happens to our equilibrium? Right, at D2, S1, we get P2 and Q2. And at that point, we have a higher price and a lower quantity, and a higher quantity, sorry, not lower, higher quantity supply. Now, what happens if you increase supply and demand stays the same? Well, actually, you get an interesting point. We go over here, right? This is where supply goes down, supply stays here, demand stays the same. You're now at a lower price and a higher quantity supplied. What this should get you thinking about is simply this. You don't actually need to know the consequences of a supply shift or a demand shift. You just need to know the direction that demand is going and whether the direction it's going is greater than the direction supply is going, or if the direction supply is going is greater than the direction demand is going. Why? Draw out the curves, and wherever equilibrium is reestablished, that tells you exactly what happens in these questions. So when you consider shifts in equilibrium, what you were interested in figuring out is what has happened to the market equilibrium quantity and the market equilibrium price. Increases in supply push price down and create higher quantity. Increases in demand push prices up and increase higher quantities demanded. Similarly, decreases in supply yield the opposite of an increase in supply. So you get higher prices and lower quantity in equilibrium when supply decreases. Similarly, when demand decreases, you actually get even higher prices. No, you get lower prices. Sorry, you get lower prices and lower quantity supplied. All right, so I highly recommend sit down with your text, read over this section, practice drawing out some of these shifts, and start practicing and figuring out and identifying what do shifts do, and also interpreting what happens at equilibrium. So just one final summary. Markets work by allowing price to signal differences between supply and demand, as we've talked about in examples of surplus and shortages, which enables producers to allocate resources to either less or more production. And what I want to say here as final point is just consider, why does equilibrium work? Because when markets are in surpluses, what ends up happening is prices push until the market equilibrium is restored. That people put their goods on sales, right? They're trying to get rid of it because they can't just have inventory sitting there. Similarly, when the market is in shortage, it usually gravitates back upward and prices push upward as items get more and more items get produced. And so again, just kind of sit down with this section, go over it, practice it, and I will see you all next time when we talk about Chapter 6, Supply, Demand, and Government Policies. All right, folks, take care. Y'all have